Since July, pro-democracy protests in Thailand have taken the country by storm. Student-led demonstrators have called for the resignation of Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha, a former army chief who seized power in a coup in 2014. They're calling for the government to make constitutional changes and to end the monarchy's backing of military coups that brought down elected governments. Now, the government has not backed down or made concessions, and the anger has now turned towards the King of Thailand, an unprecedented questioning of the highly revered monarch's place in modern Thai society. Now, after 4 months of protests, the situation remains in deadlock, and we discussed the latest today with Voronai Vanijaka, an award-winning journalist and founder and editor-in-chief of Disrupt. And we also have joining us Gregory Raymond, Research Fellow in Strategic and Defence Studies at Australian National University. Also, he was a former Department of Defence official who worked at the Australian Embassy from 2005 to 2008. So very good morning to you both, joining us from Bangkok and Canberra. Thank you so much for joining us. And well, my first question to you, Mr. Vanijaka. Now, the Parliament, earlier this week, they held a special session to discuss the mass protests that are going on, but it looks like nothing's really come out of it, and Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha has, of course, ignored demands to quit, to resign. But he did promise to address some charter amendments to the Constitution by the year end. Now, what is the situation right now as demonstrators react to this?
Well, not only did he refuse to resign, he also stepped up his rhetoric, continuing to blame everything on the protesters. And in fact, from his final speech, he actually linked the protesters to an international conspiracy to try to undermine the Thai kingdom. So his rhetoric has been very strong, and also the rhetoric of the senators and the MPs from Palang Pracharat Party, that's the government party. So we can expect the protesters to step up their game. There is going to be another big surprise. When and where, we do not know yet, but definitely the result from the parliament debate is as expected, so we can expect the protesters to step up their game.
So things aren't going to die down quite so soon. And well, Dr. Raymond, you've been observing Thai politics for a very long time. You were at the Australian Embassy in Bangkok in the noughties. And well, how does the monarch-backed military government really work? And as a long-time observer of Thai politics, were you surprised that the demonstrators' anger actually now turned to the palace? I mean, admittedly, the 68-year-old, the monarch has been a rather absent one, spending almost 6 months in a German hotel. He's got a bit of a reputation as a womanizer. He held a 4-day funeral for his dog, so perhaps not too popular among his people, quite understandably so, as the average Thai person earns less than $11 a day. So could you really have pictured this resistance happening when you were working in Bangkok?
Not at all. I was in Bangkok working at the embassy between 2005 and 2008. During that time, there were 60th anniversary celebrations for the reign of King Bhumibol Rama IX. The level of adulation, the level of love for that particular monarch was astounding, really. And for an Australian, where we have quite a, we're formally a constitutional monarchy, but our relationship with the monarch is quite different and much more, I think, distant. In Thailand, it was at a fever pitch, really, in those years. I think it would fit what the Thai historian Thongchai Winichagun has called hyper-royalism. Adulation of the royals was everywhere, on billboards, on the TV, in magazines, and so on. But a lot has changed, and really, I think there's been 3 big changes. First is a completely new generation of Thai citizens who have a very different view of the world. They're more willing to challenge established norms. They're much more plugged in to the world through social media, and they are very politically aware. So they're quite different, I think, from the Thai youth that I saw in the noughties. The second thing is, I think there's a level of exasperation with what's happened in Thai politics. They had 5 years of military rule from 2014 but then after elections, they don't feel that genuine democracy has been introduced. And that was made clear when the party that 6 million people voted for was dissolved in January. And that was a party, the Future Forward Party, that the Thai youth had really invested a lot of hope in. And the third thing is, as you've said, there's a very different relationship with this monarch as compared with the previous monarch. And I think that this generation also sees a connection between the politics and the role of the monarchy in Thailand.
Right, and Mr. Vanajaka, so this connection between the politics and the monarch, well, the protesters' 10-point manifesto calls for an end to the law that puts the king above politics, arguing that he's actually at the very centre of it. And, well, what they're calling for includes an end to the law that condemns whoever insults the king to a minimum punishment of 3 years in jail. They're calling for more transparency regarding his finances and assurances that coups will no longer be endorsed by the monarch. So in effect, they're saying that the country does not belong to the king, it rather belongs to the people who want democracy, political stability and accountabilities. Now, how has the monarch-backed military system affected the everyday lives of the Thai people, their civil liberties, especially with this regime in power?
Well, you brought up a very good point, the country, who does it belong to? Definitely, if you believe in democracy, then you believe the country belongs to the people. However, historically, traditionally, and in the minds of millions of Thais, the country does not belong to the people. The country belongs to the father, and the father is the king. And that's our cultural belief. Now, how does this affect everyday life? It doesn't if we keep our head down and do as we are told, that we can live a quote-unquote normal life. However, for those who want change, those who want reform, it becomes an almost impossibility because we're not just going up against presidents or prime ministers or dictators. We are going up against an 800 years institution, the center, the heart and mind of the Thai people. And the Prime Minister, Prayut Chan-o-cha, has done a wonderful job in identifying himself with the monarchy institution, painting the picture that he is the defender of the institution, that he is as one with the institution, that out of everyone in Thailand, he loves and defends the institution the most. So anything we do, the protesters on the street, any reform they ask for, he can paint the picture as being against the institution. And that has made this conflict unique and different from other conflicts in any other country, because we're not just talking about political system here. We're talking about what in Thailand is called the heart and mind, the identity, the DNA of the country, the institution that is respect, worship, and revere, almost godlike. So change is quite difficult, if not almost impossible, because we have to go up against that institution and that belief.
Well, as much as the royalists argue that, the youngsters are getting up to no good, that this is a generational thing, perhaps one could argue that the king himself has shown quite a generational change there, from what I gathered from your answer as well. Mr. Vanajaka, now there are also concerns that these clashes between the royalists and the demonstrators might become more forceful, and this might actually give the government more of an excuse to intervene. And Human Rights Watch, other human rights watchdogs as well, they've expressed concern that the declaration of an emergency decree also serves as a pretext for a crackdown. Right now, how divided is the country, and what are the dangers of the situation spiraling, in your view?
The country is more and more divided. The conflict started out as a generation gap and a generation clash, but increasingly it has become more and more about the monarchy, and that had to do with the royal motorcade incident that happened on October the 14th, and also the incident in which the king and the queen congratulated a man who raised the portrait of King Rama IX on October the 28th in defiance of the protesters, and things sort of spiral from there. Then we have yellow shirts come out in support of the monarchy, and a lot of them are just regular, normal citizens who love and respect the monarchy, but many of them are civil servants and bureaucrats being asked to come out, and a lot of them also are men who have a haircut similar to mine. Militaries, police, so on and so forth, in yellow shirt, coming out at these protests, and there has been a couple of minor incidents, minor clashes, nothing too serious. The police were able to break everyone up. But still, the fear is that the violence will escalate, and the only reason that it would escalate is if somebody tried to agitate for it to happen, because it would be an excuse for the military to step in for another coup d'etat. If you look at the last coup in 2014, that was precisely the reason. There's violence, there's chaos in the street, nothing can save Thailand in order to bring peace and order. Therefore, we must bring in the tanks. And when the tanks roll in, the people of Bangkok applaud the tanks because we fear violence and chaos. So perhaps, just perhaps, this is a strategy for this particular protest. Agitate so that there might be a clash between the two sides, and that could be a convenient excuse for another coup d'etat, which, going back to the demand from the protesters, the screen that you showed earlier about having a constitution with a clause that the king cannot endorse a coup d'etat. Again, we're going back to the culture of the Thais, right? Coup d'etat is not a good thing. Everybody knows that, everybody understands that. But a coup d'etat that is endorsed by the king, suddenly something that is undemocratic, something that is injustice, that something became legitimate because it's endorsed by the high power, the heart and soul of the Thai nation. So there are a lot of layers and issues in the Thai political system and the Thai culture.
And Dr. Raymond, now protesters, they marched to the German embassy in Bangkok, and they were asking Berlin to actually start a probe into the king's handling of state affairs from the European country where he spent nearly half a year, especially over the course of the coronavirus pandemic. And their foreign minister, Heiko Maas, he said that Berlin will look into it and there will be consequences if the king has been breaching the law. But do you think this will amount to anything substantial? I mean, what do you think is the most that the Germans can do in this situation?
Look, I think it's a very serious issue. I think Germany is very serious when they say they don't want a head of state conducting government business on their soil. Now, the German government will be aware that in the lead up to the March 2019 election in Thailand, that there was what appeared to be an intervention from the palace. Princess Ubonrat decided to stand as a candidate for Prime Minister, but within 24 hours there was an order, a royal order, arguing or stating that Princess Ubonrat would not be allowed to be a candidate for that election. Now that order most likely came while the current monarch was in Germany. So the German government will be aware of that, and they are a state which is quite committed to democracy and human rights. Now, as as a leading country in the EU, a country that is signed up to promoting democracy through the foreign policy of the EU, they will take that into account in dealing with issues such as whether or not to sign a free trade deal with Thailand. So there could be very serious consequences for Thailand, and coming at a time when the economy is quite weak. It was weak going into the pandemic. It was already growing at only 3%, and now it's growing. Now it's shrunk by 8%. So this is a serious matter. Both sides will want to preserve the diplomatic relationship, the good relations between Germany and Thailand. But I think it's a very, very difficult issue for both sides, both diplomats on both sides to handle.
Well, Mr. Van der Jocken, now the king himself, he's stayed silent through this series of protests, and while the palace, it does have a policy of not issuing comments to the media, but what message are the people getting from this silence, and what do they hope to see from him?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, there was an incident in which a man raised the portrait of King Rama IX, and then later on, at the royal walkabout in front of the Grand Palace, both the king and the queen walked up to him, who was in the front row, and the king said to him, patting him on the shoulder, very brave, very good, thank you. So technically, the king has remained silent, but that gesture and those words have been seen as as endorsing the one side of this political conflict against another. So the protesters, Khana Rasadon, have used those words, very brave, very good, thank you, as the slogan, the headline for their following protest, which was the march on the German embassy. And in front of the German embassy, they raised the banner, Patiroop Sathaban, reform the monarchy institution. So because of these incidents, from the royal motorcade to the congratulating the man, to the march to the German embassy, it seems right now, rather than the protesters versus the Prayut government, is the protesters versus the monarchy institution and the Prayut government. And that's where we are treading on very dangerous ground. Because again, when it comes to the heart and soul of the nation, when we talk about love and emotion, people get a little crazy, right? Politics is not just a rational characters with rational behavior. Emotions have a lot to do with it. And right now, emotions are being played with. And that emotions is what will allow the government to use violence, if it so choose to use violence. It has happened before. In 1973, in 1976, once you, quote unquote, touch the monarchy, then all gloves are off. So we are right now on a very dangerous ground.
So you've actually called for a more rational discussion. You've said, respect the king, but let's still have a discussion. And there really does seem to be no quick fix to the situation. As you said, it involves lots of emotions, a lot of love for the king, admittedly. But, well, Dr. Raymond, how do you think this situation, what do you think all sides should do to really move forward constructively?
I just want to offer a couple of comments on the possibility of violence moving ahead. I think there are a couple of reasons to be optimistic, but there are also some reasons to be anxious. The character of the protest movement this time around is different from the protesters, particularly in 2010, and their tactics are different. They are the young middle class of Bangkok. They are often from quite privileged backgrounds, attending Chulalongkorn University, Thammasat University. So I think the possibility, the thought of using violence against these younger people is quite different from what happened in 2010, when the protesters were largely poor people from villages in north and northeastern Thailand. The second thing is that the tactics of the protesters this time are very peaceful. In 2010, they were armed. It was an armed movement, and that raised the stakes considerably. So that's different this time. There's less possibility of violence, I think, breaking out. But on the reasons to be anxious, I think there is concern that conservatives are framing this situation as a battle between those who are loyal to the monarch and those who are disloyal to the monarch. And that, as Kun Waranai said, is raising the emotional level of the situation. Now, I read an article by a former head of the Thai intelligence agency who essentially said that the student movement is all being controlled by other forces, and that they want to turn Thailand into a republic, and that would be the destruction of Thailand. So they're painting a very dark picture. They are saying that there is only one way to solve this, and that's by suppressing the movement. And that is very worrying. And there is evidence that the government is starting to mobilise citizenry all over the country by using the administration at village and provincial levels. They're trying to get people out on the streets. Now, as Kun Waranai said, that is like what happened in 1976, when paramilitaries such as the village scouts were mobilised. So it's a concerning situation. At the moment, the Parliament, as an avenue for negotiation and conciliation, is not really being used. And amongst the Conservatives, there is not an appetite for any kind of genuine discussion or negotiation. And that is why the situation is concerning. There is, coming out of the special session of Parliament, some discussion about a process for constitutional change. But a lot more work needs to be done on that, otherwise the protests will not go away.
Well, as Mr. Vanajaka said, respect the king, but let's be rational as well. And hopefully this will happen. And of course, this is a country that has seen around 20 military coups since 1932. And now it seems the people are saying, we want no more we don't want any more of this. And, we do need to talk about the power of the palace, which has really given its blessing to these military coups. Well, we're going to have to wrap up the discussion here today. That was Voronai Vanajaka, founder and editor-in-chief of Disrupt, and Gregory Raymond, research fellow at Australian National University, joining us from Bangkok and Canberra. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, thank you for watching. Hope you join us again at the same time tomorrow. Till then, have a great day or evening wherever you are. Goodbye.